Yes, and I'm thrilled to be back at the Linda Hall Library. I've been here before. It is a happy place for me, and I'm happy to see such a big crowd. My. Uh, and to talk about this new book, The Elements of Marie Curie. It's really not new. It came out more than a year ago, but I'm kind of still postpartum from the from the experience. She is a powerful personality, and I yeah, just that. I'm excited to share the story with all of you, and to say first of all that this book grew out of the previous book, which often happens. So my last book was called The Glass Universe, and it was about a group of women who worked together at the Harvard College Observatory, which was a big surprise to me. I don't think of Harvard as a place where women got to work in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But this was a special situation. They got to work from photographic plates and do astronomy in the daytime and make discoveries that are still being used today. And all through that book, I kept being surprised by what the women had done. And it became really embarrassing. You know, here I am, I'm a woman, I'm interested in science. Why am I so shocked at the accomplishments of these women? And I thought probably it was a result of having grown up in the 1950s and just absorbed a lot of negative attitudes about women that were in the air. And I didn't realize how widespread that was. You know, people who, would I call myself a misogynist? No, but I had that attitude. And then I always ask, as many people as will agree, to read the manuscript for technical accuracy. And one of the people on my committee for this book was Alyssa Goodman, who's a professor of astronomy at Harvard. And she apologized early on. She said, I'm not really paying attention to your scientific explanations because I'm so gobsmacked by these women. Here I am. I've heard all their names. I know this story, but somehow I never realized they were actually doing science. So there it was again. And I thought, this is probably of epidemic proportions. And that made me want to tell more stories about women who were really scientists, because there are a lot of them. And my editor immediately said, well, how about Madame Curie? There hasn't been a biography of her in 30 years. And I thought, no, she's too famous. Everybody knows about her. I want some other story. I'll keep looking. And then I got asked to review this book. So this is a compilation of about 30-some profiles of women chemists. And of course, Madame Curie is in there, as is her daughter, and one other person I recognized. The rest were all new to me. And so that was interesting. But then, as I read, several of the women had spent time working for Madame Curie. Ooh, and by the fifth or sixth one, it really started to look like a network. And I got in touch with the Curie Museum in Paris. How many women passed through her lab? Oh, about 45. So I called George Gibson at Grove Atlantic right away. I said, I have something new to say about Madame Curie. And this is the result. So I discovered very quickly that although everybody has heard about her, hardly anybody knows anything about her. Famous scientist, Many people think she was a chemist. She was actually a physicist, and then the Nobel Prizes. But that's kind of it. And certainly I didn't know any more than that at the beginning. So I started out by reading all the existing biographies. And just from her dates of birth and death, it becomes clear she lived through a period that was a second scientific revolution. So she witnessed the discoveries of X-rays, gamma rays. She came to science at a time when the atom was still a questionable concept, but the discovery of radioactivity got scientists into the atom. So not only was the atom real, but there were subatomic particles. The notion of the quantum came up in her lifetime. The birth of atomic physics, nuclear physics. She not only witnessed all of that, she was a part of it. This is a very famous photograph. This is the first meeting of the Solvay Council. So it was an invitation-only meeting held in Brussels in 1911. And assembled around this table were the top physicists in the world. And they had come to discuss this concept of the quantum. And of course, Madame Curie is the only woman in the room. And too busy to look up in this picture, but all sorts of people are here. Max Planck is here, Albert Einstein, Ernest Rutherford. It was a truly extraordinary gathering. And this council got together approximately every 3 years. Same thing, invitation only, discussion of the most urgent questions about developments in physics. Yeah, I think this one was 1913. She is one of only 3 people in a hat. Here we are again a little later. In the Fox stole. So she was the only woman at these meetings for more than 2 decades. And by the time other women finally got invited, her daughter was one of the other women. But this is her milieu. So she had 2 daughters. The younger daughter, Eve, wrote the first biography of her mother, which was just called Madame Curie. And she says at the beginning of that book that there are so many outsized moments in her mother's life that one is tempted to tell her story as a legend. And that's true. This was a National Book Award winner. It was published in several languages, and the basis for the overly dramatic movie of the same name. Love the fact that Greer Garson played Madame Curie. So how did she get there from her beginnings in Warsaw at a time when Poland was not even a country? And she was from a family that felt its Polish cultural roots very strongly. She identified herself as Polish. In fact, even now, when Polish people hear her described as a French scientist, it's offensive. So by the time this family portrait was taken, her mother had died of TB. One of her older sisters had died of typhus. She also had an older brother who was still alive but just busy at medical school. And both her parents were teachers, and she felt that very strongly. She always wanted to be a teacher, and she was a teacher throughout her life. I'm going to go back for a minute, because in Warsaw, she could not attend university. So she and the dark-haired sister, far left, made a pact that they would help each other get to Paris and get through school. And Bronya, the older one, would go first. And when she had her degree and became a doctor, then it would be Marie's turn. But Marie worked as a governess for 7 years to earn money for this plan, which they executed successfully. And Marie's idea was always she would come back to Poland, or whatever it was called, and be a teacher and raise the standard of education. But in Paris, she met Pierre. And that changed everything. And she decided not only did their love make it impossible for them to be apart, but he convinced her that she really could be a scientist in Paris, which was not likely, and that being a scientist was the one area where they could probably make a difference. So she agreed to stay, even though she thought it would be a great sorrow to her to remain forever in Paris. One of the ways, when she married Pierre, she also got Pierre's family. And the reason she was able to do her scientific research was that Pierre's father was widowed right at the time Marie and Pierre's first daughter was born. And he moved in. He was a medical doctor, was the ideal babysitter, and just doted on this child and allowed Marie to work full-time. This is what every woman scientist needs. You know, I make a joke of it, but in the United States today, 40% of women scientists drop out when they have a child because they cannot find reliable, affordable childcare. So this is the Linda Hall Library's copy of her doctoral dissertation. All of that work on radioactivity started out as her project. It was not Pierre's project. And notice she signed herself M. Sklodowska Curie. So you always see them pictured together. Actually, what happened was, so X-rays had just been discovered in 1895, and then in France, Henri Becquerel was curious about X-rays, and he was looking for other ways they might be generated, and he fell on what he called uranic rays, which came from any compound that contained uranium, but especially from uranium. And she started looking at those because the whole scientific community was caught up with the X-rays. In that first year, there were about 1,000 scientific papers written about X-rays, and nobody was picking up on the uranic rays. So it was a good topic for a young person to get involved in. And the first thing she did was test every other element. Did anything else give them off? And yes, there was one other known element that did. And then when she was testing ores, there was an ore that had more of these rays, which she called radioactive. Instead of uranic rays, first she called them Becquerel rays, and then came up with this term, radioactivity, because the materials were radiating. And that's when Pierre got interested, because the fact that this ore was radioactive meant that there was an undiscovered element in it that was giving off this stuff. And she thought she could find it. And that would be really exciting. The periodic table was still a work in progress. So he dropped what he was doing, they worked together, and they identified something that they named polonium for Poland. And then within months, and they realized that actually there were two unknown elements in this ore, and the second one they named radium, which I had always thought was for its extreme radiant activity. But I recently learned that in Polish, that root, that rad root, means joy. And whenever they talk about their work, they talk about how wonderful it was to be in that dilapidated shed where they worked and just be doing this exciting, backbreaking, stinking work that they loved. So at the same time she was teaching, she'd gotten her teaching certificate, and she was teaching physics at an academy for young women who were going to teach in secondary schools. This is her colleague, Paul Langevin, who taught mathematics at this same school. He had been a student of Pierre's, and they were all very good, very close family friends. And then she and Pierre won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, when it was a very new thing. She was the first woman to win one in any field. And the reaction to the fact that this young husband and wife were sharing the prize with this established scientist, Becquerel, it was just a worldwide sensation. And they became the focus of all sorts of unwanted attention. They couldn't get anything done. They felt that fame could just completely ruin their lives. No privacy, no time to work. And this was their shed where they did this landmark work. It was a woefully inadequate space. The roof leaked, there was no heat. They did most of the boiling, stinking work outdoors, but sometimes they brought it indoors. They had no ventilation hoods. In fact, one scientist who visited them said he thought it was a joke, that it looked like a cross between a stable and a root cellar. You know, you couldn't believe that Nobel Prize-winning science had gone on in this space. So within 3 years of their great success, Pierre, who had not only been made a member of the Academy of Sciences in the wake of the Nobel Prize, but also a professor at the Sorbonne, and suddenly he's just killed in an accident in the street. And that really should have ended her career. At his laboratory now at the Sorbonne, she was the chief of operations. But what was going to happen now that he was gone? And she was a 38-year-old widow with 2 young children. But the science faculty at the Sorbonne realized that she was the only person who was really capable of taking over the lab. And they offered it to her. And they offered her his teaching position, his physics course. And she accepted it. For the year after Pierre died, she kept a journal of her grief in which she spoke to him. And in that journal, she says to him, she tells him that she's been offered these things and that she's decided to accept. And that on the one hand, she thinks maybe this is the only way she'll be able to live. And on the other hand, she thinks she's probably mad to accept it. But that's what she did. And then she was the only woman in the world who was the head of a laboratory and a professor at a famous university. Other women really saw her as a beacon, a magnet, and wanted to come and work for her. The first one came within months of Pierre's death, And she actually had tremendous experience in radioactivity. This young woman was at McGill University when Ernest Rutherford was teaching there, and she was his first graduate student. And she worked with him on his studies of radioactivity. So by the time she came to Madame Curie, she had about 3 years of experience. And she'd shown in the lab. Originally, she was what they called an independent researcher, which meant she was on her own. They didn't really have any funding for her, any room. The laboratory was still very small and crowded. But Andrew Carnegie gave the Curie lab $50,000 to support research, and then she could offer people like Harriet Brooks stipends to fund their research. And she offered the first such scholarship to her. But Harriet decided to get married and drop out, which was one thing. But later, and not too long after that, she convinced herself that women were not fit to do science. And she spoke about that publicly. Sometimes I think she had to convince herself that she'd done the right thing. And maybe that was why she turned against the idea. The next woman came with no experience in radioactivity from Norway, but she was an experienced chemist, and she came highly recommended. And that was what mattered most to Madame Curie, that somebody could really vouch for you as a young person, that you had the ability, the drive to do the work. And Ellen Gleditsch stayed for 5 years. While she was there, she also earned a doctoral degree and went back and was the first person in Norway to do any work in radioactivity, and stayed with it, and eventually became a full professor herself. A lot of these women just disappear. So the third one was a woman named Lucie Blanquier. And this is about all that's left of Lucie Blanquier, not even where she was born, all that's known is she had been a student of Madame Curie's at the Teaching Academy, and she became a teacher at that sort of school. She taught at several of them, and she wrote a handbook about radioactivity. And so for a while, she came and worked in Madame Curie's lab. And so these are not beautiful-looking books, but this book, the works of Pierre Curie, was something Marie helped create. She wrote the introduction to it and chose the portrait of Pierre that was published in the book. And then, as now a professor of physics at the Sorbonne, she wrote her own treatise, her own 2-volume treatise on radioactivity, which came out in 1910. This, I believe, is the Linda Hall Library copy of that book. And notice, even though this is her book, completely written by her, she signs it Madame P. Curie, and the picture in the front is of Pierre. Oh, I went backwards, sorry. So this book was very widely read and regarded, and was one of the reasons that she was put up as a candidate for election to the French Academy of Sciences. No women had ever been in any part of the French Academy. And there was a big debate about whether women should be allowed in. But she had enough supporters to get her name on the ballot, but not enough to win the vote. So she was not voted in. And this was in January of 1911. So that was a bad start to the year for her. But it was also bad for the Academy, because not being a member, hadn't been able to present her own research results at their meetings. She'd have to get a friend to present them. But now she couldn't be an evaluator of other people's research, even though she was the top expert in the country in her field. And she couldn't help decide who should get what prize money. So in a way, it was an embarrassment for the Academy as well. So this was January 1911. November of that year was that first Solvay Council meeting, when she is invited as one of the top physicists in the world. But as soon as that meeting ended, the newspapers became full of a scandalous account of the affair between Madame Curie and Paul Langevin. So this is now about 5 years after Pierre's death, and the two of them, who had been very close friends to begin with, he had been crying to her about his unhappy marriage, and she really thought he was leaving the marriage, and his wife didn't want him to do science. She just wanted him to make a good living. So I think Marie felt she was rescuing him for science, but it didn't work out that way. He stayed married, but she was seen as the villain in this disclosure because she was a foreigner and a homewrecker, whereas he was the husband and father of 4 children. And this was a terrible embarrassment to her. She was vilified in public. People surrounded her house. She felt physically in danger. And right in the middle of all this, she learned she was to win a second Nobel Prize. And this time, it was all hers. She didn't share. This was the prize in chemistry now in 1911. So now she's the first person she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. Now she's the first person to win 2 of them. And to this day, she is the only person who has ever won in both physics and chemistry. So she felt that she might disturb the solemnity of the occasion if she showed up in Stockholm, and she offered not to go. And they told her, "Don't be ridiculous. Nobody here believes the lies in the French press. Just come." And then, just a few days later, they changed their mind and they asked her not to come. And then she got angry, and she went with her sister Branya, who had helped her get through school, and her daughter Irene, who was obviously interested in science. And they had a wonderful time. Einstein, whom she had met at the first Solvay Council meeting, stayed friendly with her over the years. They were on other committees together. They went hiking together, and he defended her in the public scandal with Langevin, and just felt that it was outrageous that the rabble should be critical of her in any way. He felt she was the only person he ever knew who was completely uncorrupted by fame. So yes, now she was alone, but of course she was still working. She did many things beyond. She had managed to isolate radium. No one had seen it except as part of a compound, because even there, it's in such minuscule quantities. But she had managed to isolate it. She'd written this serious book about radioactivity, and she'd been working all this time to create a really well-outfitted laboratory, which she had succeeded in doing. But even so, there was a sense that she was nothing on her own, that really Pierre had been the brains of the operation, and she was nothing but his assistant. And that persists in places. believe it or not, even now. And her friend, Hertha Ayrton, who was also a physicist married to a physicist, noticed that and defended her in public. And when she saw in the newspaper that Pierre was credited for everything, Hertha wrote to the editor to say that, errors are notoriously hard to correct, but an error that attributes to a man work that was actually done by a woman has more lives than a cat. And so Hertha and her husband did not collaborate for that reason, because that way her work was her work. And she was the first woman admitted to the huge electrical engineering brotherhood, but not the Royal Society, because she was a wife. Yeah. So Madame Curie's idea for a fantastic laboratory, a whole freestanding building, she convinced the Pasteur Institute and the Sorbonne to support this, and they actually built her a Radium Institute. This was her building, where all the basic research went on, and then there was another building where all the medical work went on, because from the beginning, the way that radium burned their fingers immediately gained medical applications. And within a few years, radioactivity was the treatment for cancer. And it was even called Curie therapy. So this building was finally finished and ready to move into just before the outbreak of the First World War. So she was moving things in, but the entire, all of the men on the staff were mobilized for the war. And she immediately realized that this would be the first time that X-rays could be used to X-ray wounded soldiers, and that the technology was not widespread yet, and the know-how, people who could actually go to the hospitals and take the X-rays. So she got someone to give her a car, which she outfitted with portable equipment, and she began driving around. She didn't even know how to drive yet. She had a driver. 2 hospitals in Paris where soldiers had been brought to use this equipment. And then she convinced the army to let her go out to field hospitals and as close to the front as they would allow her. Over the course of the war, she personally outfitted 18 vehicles. The army did many more, and the army called them Petite Curies. And she would have to, at first, argue with the doctors that this was useful, but they were very quickly convinced. She drafted her daughter as her assistant. Irene was about 17, and was going to university at the same time, also took a nursing degree, so she could be left at various hospitals doing the X-ray work, helping people interpret the X-rays. Hertha Ayrton in England invented an anti-chemical warfare device. And this is it. This is the Ayrton fan. And it was a kind of a flapper. So if chlorine gas was exploded in your trench or near it, you could use this to get it out. And it worked. And these were actually produced, mass-produced, and distributed during the war. Took her a long time to convince people, though, to take it seriously. Because Madame Curie and her daughter could not be everywhere, she also took it upon herself to institute a course for technicians. So this was a course for women. You had to be 21 years old, didn't have to have any special education, just be really motivated. And in 6 weeks, she would teach you everything you needed to know about electricity, X-ray theory, practice, and human anatomy. And off you would go. She trained 150 women during the war to do that work. And after the war, she wrote a book about her experiences and continued. See, this was an iteration of her course for American soldiers. And you can see both her and her daughter in this picture because they were both teachers in the course. She is still Madame Pierre Curie in her byline, and she hated war. And she talked about how many times she had seen a young man brought to her in a mixture of mud and blood, dying of his injuries. And she said you didn't have to see that too many times to hate the idea of war. But by this point, she is a great heroine, humanitarian, especially for the cancer treatment. And she was courted by an American writer, editor, Marie Maloney, who was far right in this picture, and who volunteered to raise money from the women of America to buy Madame Curie a gram of radium, and then to bring her with her daughters to this country and have her travel around and be celebrated, just the kind of thing Madame Curie hated, but she couldn't turn down that gift. And it was difficult for her because the reception was so enthusiastic that within no time she had her arm in a sling. You know, people had just pumped her arm with, but she survived it somehow. Here she is receiving the gram of radium from President Warren Harding at the White House, or at least a symbolic representation of it. The actual radium was really at the Bureau of Standards, and she collected it later. So this was in 1921. She was back in 1929, another gift of radium for a Radium Institute in Warsaw, and this time it was President Hoover at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. So as part of that first trip, she was offered an enormous sum of money if she would write her autobiography, which she just couldn't do. I mean, to her, that was the most ridiculous thing. She said, I could tell my life story in a paragraph. But it was so much money that could be used for research that she countered, well, she could write her husband's biography. So that's what she did. And again, she used that same picture of Pierre. So you'll see the book is in English. She wrote it in French, but this was commissioned by an American publisher. So they, of course, had it translated right away. And I don't know that it was ever published in French. I was not able to get a copy in French, but I did get a copy in English. I am a great fan of Bill Ashworth's Scientist of the Day blog. Hope all of you read that on the magazine. Yes, on the magazine, on the library's website. And he talks about different scientists, and there's usually a tie-in with some wonderful book in the library's holdings. So sometimes he has a book that's his personal copy of something, and he'll show that and say author's copy. So this is my copy of Pierre Curie, and I don't have nice book holding openers, but I thought you would enjoy this ruler that somebody bought me on the bottom. On the other side, it actually has inches and centimeters, but it's about great women rulers in science, with Madame Curie's picture at the top. Yeah. So Irene followed her mother into the lab, eventually became director of the lab. The younger daughter was always artistic, musical, not interested in science, but they all got along great. And some of the best resources I had were the collections of letters that the three of them wrote to each other, because they wrote to each other all their lives about everything. And then Irene later also wrote, not really a biography, but sketches of what it was like to be Madame Curie's daughter. Not only did she follow her mother into the lab, she married her lab partner, and together they also won a Nobel Prize. And this is not my copy, but this Irene and her husband, Frederick Joliot, helped finish. When Marie died, she was doing a revised edition of her book about radioactivity. The two of them finished that work, and then Irene helped publish Madame Curie's collected works, both in French and Polish. So Irene had also tried to get into the French Academy of Sciences, and being a kind of feisty character, she tried a few times and never got in. And just to show again, but you could be a Nobel Prize winner, and if you're a woman, you just weren't going to get in. So the first woman in France who gained entry into the Academy of Sciences was this person, Marguerite Perret, who was the last person Madame Curie hired as a lab technician before she died. And the reason Marguerite Perret became a lab technician was that she wanted to be a doctor, but her father died when she was very young. Her mother had, I think, 4 other children. There was no way to get through medical school, so she did the best she could. She became a lab technician. But as soon as she was in the lab, everybody realized what a talent she was. And they gave her a lot of interesting things to do. And she went on to discover an element, and the element francium. And at that point, Irene and other people in the lab encouraged her to get her doctorate. She wrote her dissertation about the discovery of francium. And she went on and became a professor, head of a laboratory, and really had a remarkable professional career. But she wasn't really a full voting member of the Academy. That didn't happen until 1979. And that was Yvonne Choquet-Bruhat, who was a physicist, was the first woman who was really a full voting member of the Academy of Sciences in France. So this is my last picture. One of the things that surprised me the most in the course of doing this research was the number of people who revered Madame Curie, who would say things to me like, "Oh, she's my hero." This is somebody who's been dead a long time, but has not been replaced in the hearts of many people. And I think part of the reason was her great humanity, that she was known as someone who was completely dedicated and never got full of herself, that kept her same simple dress and manner, whatever she was doing, even meeting the President of the United States, whatever it was, she was herself. And then the way she inspires young people to go into science. You think if you were going to have a role model, you'd pick someone whose achievements you might hope to emulate. How do you follow up somebody who's won 2 Nobel Prizes? But it doesn't matter. She still works. And And she was great company for me during the pandemic, because her attitude about adversity was something just so admirable. Whatever it was, you're barred from university, whatever they told her she couldn't do, she didn't spend a moment complaining about it. She just figured, how can we get around this? And then managed to get around it. And so we have time for questions, but I'll leave you with one anecdote. Last spring, I spoke at the National Academy of Sciences, and it was a luncheon, so it wasn't really a formal lecture, and there was a lot of back and forth, and these people were pretty unhappy. Last spring, when it was starting to be clear what would happen to scientific research under the Trump presidency, so they were grim, but nevertheless, they were glad to see each other. It was very sociable. And a woman, Huda Akil, got up at the microphone, and she said that when she was growing up in Syria, she was in a convent school, and one of the nuns gave her a biography of Madame Curie from the school library to read. And she said, it was life-changing. First of all, a woman could be a scientist. I had no idea. I'd never seen such a thing. And then, if you were born in a country that didn't have room for your abilities, you could go to a country that did. And that's how she got here. So maybe some of you have Madame Curie inspiration stories. If so, I would love to hear them. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. Okay, brace yourselves. The lights are about to come up. All right.
When I read your book, one of the first things that struck me at such a young age, how many languages she already knew. I was so impressed with her intellect like that.
Yes, people in Europe in general tend to speak several languages at an early age. And again, her parents were both teachers, so they were both well educated. And her father read English and would translate into Polish. The children didn't speak English. She learned that later. But she spoke Russian in school. They knew French and German. If you were a scientist, you had to have French and German. Yeah.
All right, we have a question from an online viewer. Did Marie Curie know about the women known as the Radium girls, and did she make any comment on what happened to them?
I'm very glad that came up because I didn't mention it. So Madame Curie was aware early on that this material was dangerous because she could see what happened to her hands. But it was so interesting, it was so important, it had such tremendous use in various fields. She didn't worry about personal safety. But over the years, she became concerned, and they were careful to have ventilation hoods. They had periodic blood tests beginning around 1920. And people would start to feel really tired sometimes, and they'd be told to take a few days off and spend a lot of time in the fresh air. But then they all wanted to come back to work. But in, I think it was 1925, the first lawsuit. So Madame Curie is doing basic research, and then her colleagues are doing medical research. It was never her idea to put radium in paint, and then to use the paint on watch faces and instrument dials, and to tell the young women painting these things after they dip the brush in the paint that actually contains radium, to put it in their mouths and bring it to a fine point. So radium is similar to calcium, and if you ingest it, it lodges in your bones, and it has a half-life of 1,600 years. So several of these women started to lose their teeth. Their jaws broke. They felt terrible, sick, and a lawsuit was brought against the American Radium Company, the manufacturer of this paint, which was called Undark, to prove that this was an occupational illness. This was before OSHA. And so it was at that point she became aware of their plight, and she did make a public statement about how they deserved medical treatment, sympathy, whatever compensation was available. But unfortunately, there was nothing that could be done for them. There was no way to get the radium out of their bodies.
All right, final call for questions.
Here's somebody.
I've got you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the book. Just a question. Each of the chapters has the name of a person, and then in parentheses, the name of an element. And I have read the book, and I'm like trying to figure out, what did the name of the element, how did that tie in?
Did you figure it out? No. Oh, okay. Okay, well, this is great because, usually I write these books and then I get invited to speak as a subject matter expert, but never as a writer. How am I going to frame this story? How is it going to break down and be shaped and divided into chapters? And those are all things, of course, I think about a lot. So at first, I wanted it to be just about the women. It wasn't going to be her story with the women brought in, but it didn't work. So then each chapter had to be somebody who was either helping her, it was who she was. So it starts out Manya, which is her nickname in childhood. But then it's who she was. She becomes Madame Curie by chapter 3. And then it's who the other people are in the lab she's working with or she's mentoring. And sometimes, that person in the name of the chapter always shows up in the chapter. Sometimes there isn't much said about that person because, again, these women pass through the lab. Women's names fall out of the scientific record all the time. They fall off the papers, they fall off the prize citations. So it's hard to keep them in. And even the women who work there, some of those records are really fragmentary. So I've been criticized that some of the chapters don't say much about the people, but there isn't much known. So, but then the element, which element goes with what happened in that chapter? So that was kind of fun for me to put together as a challenge. And I thought, some people reading this book will enjoy that as a kind of subplot, if you will. And there's usually a reason. So the chapter about Iran, which is the beginning of the First World War, the element is lead, which is what the bullets were made of. So, I didn't have to say that. I think it was just kind of obvious. And then the chapter where Mrs. Ayrton and her fan come in, that was chlorine. So it's always something. And it's there. It doesn't jump out at you, I know, but that was my thinking.
Staying near the front.
It's impressive the amount of adversity that she went through, but the one thing that really impressed me when I read the book was she was ill so much of this story.
Yes. So Madame Curie was ill much of her life. And what were those illnesses? it is possible that she was a TB carrier. Her mother tried to shield the family. She had kept separate dishes. She stopped hugging and kissing the children. But that is not known that she was a carrier. She had some kind of kidney problem. She had problems that were related to radiation, especially X-ray exposure, which must have been, people always think it was the radium that killed her. But all through the war, she was taking X-rays all day long with primitive equipment, wearing a cotton smock. If you go to the dentist, they put a lead blanket on you and the dentist walks out of the room. So it was a combination of those things. But yeah, she spent a tremendous amount of time. She lost a whole year of just being bedridden, really, and not being in the lab at all.
Towards the middle here.
Thank you. I was wondering your thoughts on how women in science as a profession has improved in the 21st century or not. Kind of based on, I realized, like, looking at the pictures of the Sorbonne that, Madame Curie stood out as a female. It isn't much different in many rooms of science today.
It isn't, and it's getting worse. So I'm not happy about that. And I think about that a lot. Women have to really, I think just talking about how hard it is, the childcare thing. Even if you make it and you're there, that's going to be a problem. Can we make it better? We could. But it would take everybody's agreeing that it was worth doing. And now I think the struggle is just to keep science funded and going. So many things are going backwards. I don't feel that in this room, in this building, but abroad in the land, there's a lot to be fearful about. So, and one thing I think about is the whole question of scientific research. What is it? And the fact that most people have no idea. Because how many people know a scientist? Yeah, let's put it as a question. Do you personally know a scientist? Have you ever met a scientist? Okay, so even in this room, I think it's not most people. And then what do those people do all day? It's a big mystery. What is scientific research? It's any one of a gazillion things. But years ago, I had the best job of my life. I had a column for Discover magazine where I just would approach various scientists and say, can I follow you around for 3 days and write about what you do? Because it's different. Everybody's doing something different. And I think if people had some sense of that, that would help. And there is this also this idea that women are given the boring stuff to do. Like the Harvard women, that's the story you'll hear. They were hired because the men didn't want to do the boring scut work. Well, that was the essence of the science. The men do, that's what it is. If that's what you're interested in, it's not boring. Even if you're doing the same thing 100 times, it's not boring to you. And, but the women do the scut work and the men have the aha moment 24/7. That's just the impression that's given. One very good book that I enjoyed reading, this is Katalin Carrie Coe, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in, was it 2023? Recent. And she wrote a book called Breaking Through about her experiences. She was born in Hungary, didn't look like she would have much chance to do her work. But in Hungary, there was affordable childcare. And she was able to do all sorts of things and continue before she came to this country. And here, she was very rudely surprised to see what a different situation that was. But she says at the beginning of the book something like, a woman sits at a laboratory bench. Sometimes she sits for 40 years. You know, because that's what it looks like if you're on the outside looking in. Well, the person just sitting there, you know. maybe looking at something in a microscope, thinking about, I don't know. That's why I tried to give so much detail about what they were actually doing in the lab. My friends tell me that when they read my books, they skip over the science parts. Yeah. So we all have to try. Yeah. It really is important. It really is interesting. It deserves funding and respect.
Well, thank you so much, Dava. And thank you all for joining us tonight. As a reminder, Rainy Day Book is facilitating a book signing over in the west side of the room, so please join us for that. And to check in for all the spectacular programming we have at the library, visit lindahall.org. And for World War I Museum and Memorial, visit theworldwar.org. Thank you, and have a great rest of your evening.